The dust cloud appeared first, a thin line against the Texas horizon where the heat made the air dance like ghosts. Mason Rodriguez wiped the sweat from his forehead and squinted toward the dirt road that led to his ranch. Nothing came down that road anymore, not since the bank had started circling like vultures and the neighbors had moved to the city one by one. The Lazy R Ranch had become an island in a sea of abandoned dreams, and Mason preferred it that way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But this dust cloud was different. It moved too slow for a truck, too unsteady for a horse. Mason set down the fence post he'd been hammering and walked toward the gate, his boots crunching on the dried grass that hadn't seen rain in 3 weeks. The sun was merciless overhead, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, making the landscape shimmer like a mirage. As the dust settled, Mason's jaw dropped. A woman emerged from the haze, walking barefoot along the scorching asphalt. Her feet were caked with dirt and what looked like dried blood, her steps careful but determined. She wore a faded blue dress that had seen better days, torn at the hem and stained with travel. In her arms she cradled a baby that couldn't have been more than 6 months old, its tiny fist clutching at her dress while it slept against her shoulder. But it wasn't the woman or the baby that made Mason rub his eyes and look again. Behind her she dragged a makeshift sled constructed from what appeared to be old wooden planks and rope. On top of it sat a chicken coop, weathered and patched but sturdy, with 3 hens inside clucking softly in the heat. The whole contraption left deep grooves in the dusty road, and Mason could see the strain in the woman's shoulders as she pulled her unusual cargo. She stopped at his gate, swaying slightly on her feet. Her dark hair was plastered to her scalp with sweat, and her olive skin was flushed with exhaustion and heat. When she looked up at him, her brown eyes held a mixture of desperation and fierce determination that Mason had seen in wild horses cornered by storms. "Water," she said, her voice cracked and barely above a whisper. "Please, for the baby." Mason didn't hesitate. He unlatched the gate and stepped forward, his hands already reaching for the child. "Come on up to the house," he said, his voice gentle despite his surprise. "Both of you look about ready to drop." The woman's knees buckled as she tried to take another step. Mason caught her elbow, steadying her while being careful not to jostle the baby. Up close, he could see the tracks of dried tears on her cheeks and the way her lips were cracked from dehydration. Her feet were worse than he'd thought, cut and bleeding from what must have been miles of walking on rough pavement. "The chickens," she mumbled, glancing back at the coop with worry. "They need water too." "I'll take care of them," Mason assured her. "Right now, let's get you and this little one out of the sun." The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft whimper. The woman's entire body tensed with protective instincts, her arms tightening around the child. Mason could see the love and terror warring in her expression, the way she held that baby like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. "What's your name?" Mason asked as he helped her toward the ranch house, his free hand hovering near her elbow in case she stumbled again. "Elena," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Elena Morales. And this is Sophia." She pressed a kiss to the baby's forehead, her voice softening as she spoke her daughter's name. "I'm Mason," he replied. "Mason Rodriguez. And you're both welcome here." The ranch house sat low and sprawling against the landscape, its adobe walls painted white to reflect the brutal Texas sun. A wraparound porch provided blessed shade, and Mason guided Elena to one of the wooden chairs that his grandmother had carved decades ago. The baby stirred again as Elena sat down, her tiny eyes blinking open to reveal the same deep brown as her mother's. "She's beautiful," Mason said, and meant it. Sophia had the kind of perfect features that made strangers smile, with thick dark hair and skin that glowed with health despite their circumstances. Elena managed a weak smile. "She's everything," she whispered. Mason disappeared into the house and returned moments later with a pitcher of cold water and a glass. Elena's hands shook as she lifted the glass to her lips, drinking slowly but steadily. Some of the color began to return to her cheeks, and the baby seemed to sense her mother's relief, settling back into peaceful sleep. "The chickens," Elena said again, looking toward the gate where the makeshift sled sat abandoned in the sun. Already on it, Mason replied. He jogged back to the gate and began pulling the sled toward the house. The 3 hens inside the coop clucked with indignation at the movement, their feathers ruffled and their beady eyes alert. Mason could see they were good birds. Rhode Island reds with glossy feathers and bright eyes. Someone had taken care of them, even in whatever circumstances had led Elena to this moment. He positioned the coop in the shade of the porch and opened the small door. The hens emerged cautiously, their heads bobbing as they explored their new surroundings. Mason filled a shallow pan with water and scattered some feed he kept for the wild birds. The chickens descended on both with enthusiasm, their soft clucking filling the air with something that sounded almost like contentment. Elena watched from her chair, her body visibly relaxing as she saw her birds being cared for. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "They've been with us through everything." Mason settled into the chair beside her, keeping his distance but close enough to help if she needed it. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in the first hints of orange and pink. A gentle breeze stirred the dust, bringing with it the scent of sage and distant rain. "How far did you walk?" Mason asked gently. Elena looked down at her feet, which were propped on the porch railing. The cuts and blisters told their own story. "I don't know," she admitted. 3 days, maybe 4. I lost count." Mason's jaw tightened. 3 days in this heat, with a baby and pulling that heavy sled. It was a miracle she was still standing. "Where did you come from?" "San Antonio," Elena said after a pause. "Started from there anyway." Mason did the mental calculation. San Antonio was over 200 miles away. Even if she'd caught rides part of the way, the idea of a woman with a baby making that journey on foot was staggering. There had to be a story there, one that involved the kind of desperation that made impossible things seem like the only option. "What brought you out this way?" he asked carefully. Elena's arms tightened around Sophia, and Mason saw the walls go up in her expression. "I needed to go somewhere," she said simply. "Somewhere safe." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mason had grown up on this ranch, had seen his share of people running from things they couldn't name. He'd learned when to push and when to let silence do the talking. This was definitely a time for silence. Sophia began to fuss, her tiny face scrunching up as she worked toward a full cry. Elena immediately shifted into action, bouncing the baby gently and making soft shushing sounds. But Sophia was having none of it, her cries growing louder and more insistent. "She's hungry," Elena said, looking around with the kind of panic that new mothers knew well. "I need to feed her, but you need privacy," Mason finished. "The guest room is just inside, first door on the right. Take all the time you need." Elena started to stand, then swayed dangerously. Mason was on his feet in an instant, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Easy there. When's the last time you ate something?" Elena's silence was answer enough. Mason shook his head, his protective instincts kicking into high gear. "Feed the baby first, then we're getting some food in you." No arguments. Elena's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Mason thought she might collapse entirely. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with a dignity that made his chest tight. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. "I can't pay you for this." Mason's voice was firm but gentle. "Did I ask for money?" "No, but nothing. You're a mother with a baby who needs help. That's all I need to know." Elena stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was real or just another desert mirage. Finally, she nodded and made her way into the house, Sophia's cries echoing through the screen door. Mason stood on the porch, listening to the gentle sounds of the chickens and watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The Lazy R ranch had been quiet for too long, filled only with the ghosts of better times and the weight of his own solitude. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Something about Elena and Sophia felt like a shift in the wind, like the first promise of rain after a long drought. One of the hens, a particularly bold Rhode Island red with a white patch on her breast, hopped onto the porch railing and fixed Mason with a beady stare. She let out a soft cluck that sounded almost conversational. "Well, hello there, girl," Mason said, extending his hand slowly. The hen considered him for a moment, then allowed him to stroke her glossy feathers. "You've been taking care of them, haven't you?" "Looking out for your humans on that long walk." The hen preened under his attention, her head bobbing with what looked like pride. Mason found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. There was something about chickens that was fundamentally optimistic, he'd always thought. They woke up every morning expecting good things, ready to scratch and peck their way to happiness. The crying from inside the house had stopped, replaced by the gentle murmur of Elena's voice as she spoke to Sophia in soft Spanish. Mason caught fragments of lullabies and endearments, the kind of words that only mothers knew how to say. It was a sound the old house hadn't heard in far too long. His grandmother, Rosa, had raised him in this house after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. She'd been the kind of woman who could make miracles happen with cornmeal and hope, who knew exactly how to heal both broken bones and broken hearts. The house had been full of her laughter and her stories, her cooking and her wisdom. When she'd passed 5 years ago, Mason had inherited not just the ranch, but the weight of all that emptiness. The screen door creaked open, and Elena emerged with Sophia cradled against her shoulder. The baby looked content now, her tiny fist curled around a strand of her mother's hair. Elena had managed to smooth her own hair back and wash some of the dust from her face, revealing features that were both strong and delicate. "Better?" Mason asked. Elena nodded, settling back into her chair. "Much. Thank you for being patient with us." "No need to thank me. You hungry?" Elena's stomach answered before she could, rumbling loudly enough to make Sophia startle. Elena blushed, but Mason just chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes. What do you say we get some real food in you?" "I should help," Elena protested as Mason stood up. "You should rest," Mason countered. "You've done enough traveling for one day." He disappeared into the house and returned 20 minutes later, with a plate piled high with scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and sliced avocado. The eggs were still steaming, cooked just until they were creamy and perfect. Elena's eyes widened at the sight, and Mason could see her fighting back tears again. "It's too much," she whispered. "It's exactly enough," Mason replied, setting the plate in her lap. "Eat." Elena didn't need to be told twice. She ate with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, pausing only to adjust Sophia's position or take sips of the fresh water Mason kept bringing her. The chickens had found comfortable spots in the shade near the porch steps, their soft clucking providing a peaceful soundtrack to the evening. As Elena ate, Mason found himself studying her face. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her early 20s, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't need makeup or fancy clothes to shine through. But there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worry, and a tension in her shoulders that suggested she was always ready to run. "The eggs are perfect," Elena said, glancing toward the chickens. "Fresh eggs make all the difference." "Those your birds?" Mason asked, gesturing toward the Rhode Island reds. Elena nodded, her expression softening. "Esperanza, Fe, and Caridad. Hope, faith, and charity. My grandmother's names for them." She smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, it reached her eyes. She always said chickens were God's way of making sure people had what they needed to survive. Smart woman, your grandmother. She was. Elena's smile faded slightly. She would have liked this place. The open space. The quiet. Mason sensed there was more to that story, but he didn't push. Instead, he watched as Esperanza hopped back onto the porch railing, fixing Elena with what could only be described as a reproachful look. "She's wondering why you made her walk so far," Mason observed. Elena laughed, a real laugh that transformed her entire face. "She's been giving me attitude for 3 days. I think she expected me to carry her, instead of the other way around." "Well, she's got a point. That's a long way for a chicken to travel." "It's a long way for anyone to travel," Elena said quietly. The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple. The heat of the day was beginning to fade, replaced by the gentler warmth of evening. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Sophia stirred in Elena's arms, making the soft, snuffling sounds that babies make when they're dreaming. Elena's face softened as she looked down at her daughter, her fingers tracing the baby's perfect features with infinite tenderness. "She's lucky to have you," Mason said softly. Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "I hope so. I'm trying to give her something better than what I had." Mason felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the fierce love and determination in Elena's voice. It was the same tone his grandmother had used when she talked about raising him, the same unwavering commitment to doing whatever it took to protect the people who mattered. "How old is she?" Mason asked. 5 months, Elena replied. "Born on Christmas morning, like a little gift. Sophia's a beautiful name." "It means wisdom," Elena said. "I figured she was going to need all the wisdom she could get in this world." The chickens had settled in for the night, tucking their heads under their wings in the comfortable way of creatures who felt safe. Mason glanced at Elena, noting the exhaustion that was beginning to show around her eyes despite the food and rest. "You need sleep," he said gently. "Both of you." Elena looked around uncertainly. "I don't want to impose. Maybe there's a barn or—" "Guest room," Mason interrupted firmly. "Clean sheets, soft bed, and a bassinet my grandmother kept for when the neighbors' babies visited. You're not sleeping in a barn." "I can't pay you," Elena said again, her voice small. Mason was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the chickens, then at Elena and Sophia. An idea was forming in his mind, something that might solve more than one problem. "Tell me about the eggs," he said finally. Elena looked confused. "What about them?" "Your chickens. How often do they lay?" "Every day," Elena said with obvious pride. "Sometimes twice a day for Esperanza. She's always been my best layer." Mason nodded slowly. "Good eggs are hard to come by out here. The closest store is 30 miles away, and half the time their eggs are older than dirt." Elena's brow furrowed as she tried to follow his train of thought. "I'm not sure what you're getting at." Mason leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees. "What if I made you a deal? You and Sophia stay here, take care of the chickens, and in exchange, I get fresh eggs every day. Fair trade." Elena stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "You want to trade room and board for eggs?" "Daily eggs," Mason clarified with a small smile. "Your grandmother was right about chickens being God's way of making sure people have what they need. Maybe that works both ways." Elena was quiet for so long that Mason began to wonder if he'd overstepped. The offer had come from a place of instinct rather than careful thought, but now that he'd said it, it felt right. The ranch was too big for one person, too quiet for one voice, and Elena and Sophia clearly needed somewhere safe to land. "Why?" Elena asked finally. "You don't know anything about me. I could be running from the law. I could be crazy. I could—" "Could be a lot of things," Mason agreed, "but you're not. A woman running from the law doesn't drag a chicken coop 200 miles. And crazy people don't take that kind of care with their animals." Elena looked down at Sophia, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "What if the eggs aren't enough? What if the chickens get sick or stop laying or—" "Then we'll figure something else out," Mason said simply. "But I've got a feeling those birds of yours are going to do just fine." As if summoned by the conversation, Esperanza let out a soft cluck from her perch on the railing. Elena looked at the hen, then at Mason, then out at the vast expanse of the ranch that stretched away into the gathering darkness. "It's temporary," she said finally. "Just until I can figure out what comes next." Mason nodded, though something in his chest suggested that temporary might turn into something else entirely. Just until you figure out what comes next. Elena's shoulders sagged with relief so profound that Mason could see it in every line of her body. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked like she might actually believe that things could be okay. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." Mason stood up and gently took Sophia from Elena's arms, cradling the baby with the careful competence of someone who'd helped his grandmother with every visiting child for years. Sophia stirred but didn't wake, her tiny hand grasping at the fabric of his shirt. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you both settled in." Elena followed him into the house, her bare feet silent on the cool tile floors. The guest room was exactly as Mason had described it. Clean and comfortable, with a wooden bassinet tucked into the corner, and windows that looked out over the ranch. Elena sank onto the edge of the bed, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been driving her for days. Mason gently placed Sophia in the bassinet, tucking a soft blanket around her tiny form. The baby sighed in her sleep, her face peaceful and content. "There are clean towels in the bathroom," Mason said quietly, "and I'll leave some clothes outside the door. They might be too big, but they're clean." Elena nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Mason, Get some rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow's a new day." He closed the door softly behind him, leaving Elena and Sophia to the quiet sanctuary of the guest room. Outside, the chickens had found comfortable roosts near the porch, their soft sounds mixing with the evening chorus of crickets and distant cattle lowing. Mason stood in his kitchen looking out the window at the makeshift chicken coop and thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning, he'd been a solitary rancher, facing the slow decline of everything his family had built. Tonight, he was sharing his home with a woman and her baby, 3 chickens, and the promise of fresh eggs every morning. His grandmother Rosa would have loved this. She'd always said that the best things in life came when you weren't looking for them, when you opened your door to whatever the wind blew in. Lena and Sophia hadn't been blown in by the wind exactly, but they'd arrived with the same kind of unexpected grace that Rosa had always recognized as a blessing in disguise. Mason pulled together a simple dinner for himself, but found he wasn't particularly hungry. Instead, he sat on the front porch, listening to the sounds of his ranch settling into night, and thinking about the look in Elena's eyes when she'd accepted his offer. It had been relief, yes, but something else too. Hope, maybe. The kind of tentative hope that came after you'd been disappointed too many times to believe in easy answers. The chickens rustled softly in their temporary roost, and Mason found himself looking forward to building them a proper coop. He'd been meaning to get chickens for years, but had never quite gotten around to it. Now it seemed like the most natural thing in the world, like Elena and her birds had simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive. Esperanza lifted her head as if she'd heard his thoughts, fixing him with that intelligent stare that chickens somehow managed, despite their reputation for being simple creatures. Mason could swear she nodded at him before tucking her head back under her wing. "Welcome to the Lazy R," he said softly to the sleeping birds. "I've got a feeling you're going to like it here." Inside the house, all was quiet. Elena and Sophia were safe, fed, and resting for the first time in who knew how long. Tomorrow would bring questions and conversations, plans and possibilities. But tonight, there was just the peaceful silence of a house that finally felt like a home again. Mason sat on his porch until the stars came out, thinking about eggs and second chances, about the way life could surprise you when you least expected it. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and promise, and for the first time in years, Mason Rodriguez felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Elena woke to the sound of roosters crowing, though it took her a moment to remember that she didn't have any roosters. The morning light filtered through unfamiliar curtains, and for a terrifying instant, she couldn't remember where she was. Then Sophia stirred in the bassinet beside the bed, making the soft mewing sounds that meant she was hungry, and everything came flooding back. The ranch. Mason. The deal for eggs. She sat up slowly, her body protesting after days of walking and a night of actual rest. Through the window, she could see Mason moving around the yard, already dressed and working despite the early hour. The 3 hens were pecking contentedly in the dirt near what looked like a hastily constructed fence to keep them contained. Sophia's mewing escalated to a proper fuss, and Elena quickly scooped her up before the crying could wake the entire house. The baby settled against her shoulder, her tiny fist tangling in Elena's hair as she nursed. In the quiet of the morning, Elena allowed herself to really look at the room Mason had given them. The walls were painted a warm cream color, and the furniture was simple but well made. A quilted bedspread covered the double bed, and the bassinet had obviously been loved by many babies over the years. There were small touches that spoke of a woman's influence. A vase of dried wildflowers on the dresser, curtains with tiny blue flowers, a rocking chair positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. Elena found clean clothes folded neatly outside her door, just as Mason had promised. The jeans were too long and had to be rolled up, and the cotton shirt hung loose on her frame, but they were clean and soft and smelled like sunshine and fabric softener. There were even socks and a pair of women's boots that were only slightly too big. When she emerged from the guest room with Sophia, she found Mason in the kitchen, standing over the stove with a spatula in his hand. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, making her stomach rumble despite the meal she'd eaten the night before. "Morning," Mason said without turning around. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," Elena admitted, settling Sophia in the crook of her arm. "Thank you for the clothes. They fit well enough." Mason glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "They were my grandmother's. She was about your size, maybe a little taller. She would have wanted you to have them." Elena touched the soft fabric of the shirt, imagining the woman who had worn it before her. She must have been very kind. "Kindest woman who ever lived," Mason replied, flipping bacon in the pan. "She used to say that kindness was the only thing that multiplied when you gave it away." He set a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast in front of Elena, along with a steaming mug of coffee. The eggs were perfect again, fluffy and seasoned just right, and Elena found herself wondering how long it had been since someone had cooked for her without expecting something in return. "What can I do to help?" Elena asked between bites. "I don't want to just sit around while you do all the work." Mason considered this as he poured himself coffee. "Well, I was thinking we should build your girls a proper coop. Can't have them living in that travel contraption forever." Elena's eyes lit up. "I know how to build things. My father was a carpenter before." She trailed off, the mention of her past casting a shadow over her expression. Mason pretended not to notice the change in her mood. "Perfect. I've got lumber and tools in the barn. We can start after breakfast if you're up for it." Elena nodded eagerly. The idea of working with her hands, of building something permanent for her chickens, felt like the first step toward building something permanent for herself and Sophia. They spent the morning measuring and cutting lumber, working side by side in the comfortable rhythm of people who understood the value of good work. Elena proved to be surprisingly skilled with tools, her hands sure and steady as she helped frame the walls of the new coop. Sophia napped in a basket nearby, shaded by the barn's overhang and lulled by the sounds of construction. "Where did you learn to work with wood?" Mason asked as Elena expertly notched a beam. "My father taught me," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. He said, "Every person should know how to build the things they need." Mason heard the past tense and the careful tone, but didn't push. Instead, he handed her another board and watched as she measured it with practiced ease. Whatever Elena's story was, it was clear that she'd learned more than carpentry from her father. By midday, they had the frame of the coop completed and were starting on the roof. The work was hot and demanding, but Elena attacked it with the kind of focused energy that spoke of someone who needed to stay busy to keep darker thoughts at bay. Esperanza had been supervising the construction from her perch on a nearby fence post, occasionally offering commentary in the form of soft clucks and head bobs. When Elena took a break to drink water, the hen hopped down and began inspecting the work, walking through the frame with the air of a demanding contractor. "She's very particular," Elena said, watching her favorite hen with obvious affection. "Smart bird," Mason replied. "She wants to make sure her new home is up to her standards." Elena laughed, and Mason realized it was becoming one of his favorite sounds. There was music in it, something light and genuine that had probably been missing from her life for too long. They worked through the afternoon, pausing only when Sophia needed attention or when the heat became too intense. Elena proved to be not only skilled, but tireless, throwing herself into the project with the kind of determination that impressed Mason more than any amount of experience could have. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they stepped back to admire their work. The coop was spacious and well built, with nesting boxes positioned to catch the morning light and a secure run that would keep the hens safe from predators. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly, and Mason could hear the emotion in her voice. "It's home," Mason replied. "For all of you." Elena turned to look at him, her brown eyes serious. "You know this is more than just about eggs, don't you?" Mason met her gaze steadily. "I know." They moved the hens into their new coop as the light began to fade. Esperanza, Faye, and Caridad explored their new quarters with obvious approval, scratching in the fresh dirt and testing out the nesting boxes. Within minutes, they had settled in as if they'd always lived there. "They like it," Elena observed, watching her birds with satisfaction. "Course they do. It's the finest chicken coop in 3 counties." Elena smiled, but Mason could see the exhaustion beginning to show around her eyes. Building the coop had taken most of their energy, and she was still recovering from her long journey. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get some dinner in you." They ate on the porch as the stars began to appear, sharing a simple meal of grilled chicken and vegetables from Mason's garden. Sophia was content in Elena's arms, making the soft cooing sounds that babies make when they're happy and fed. "Tell me about this place," Elena said, gesturing toward the vast expanse of the ranch. Mason leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. "My great-grandfather homesteaded this land in 1892, built the original house with his own hands, raised cattle and horses, scratched out a living from dirt and determination." "It must be wonderful to have that kind of history," Elena said wistfully. "It is and it isn't," Mason replied honestly. "Sometimes history feels more like a weight than a gift. All those generations of Rodriguez men working this land, building something to pass down, makes a man wonder if he's worthy of it." Elena studied his profile in the growing darkness. "You seem plenty worthy to me." Mason felt something warm settle in his chest at her words. "Some days I'm not so sure. Ranch has been struggling the last few years. Drought, cattle prices, cost of everything going up while income stays the same. There are days I wonder if I'm just the Rodriguez who's going to lose it all." "Is that why you're out here alone?" Elena asked gently. Mason was quiet for a long moment. "Partly. Had a wife once. Sarah. She was a city girl who thought she wanted the ranching life. Turns out what she really wanted was the idea of it, not the reality. Long days, uncertain income, being miles from the nearest shopping mall. She lasted 2 years before she decided she'd made a mistake." Elena winced. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. She wasn't wrong. Exactly. Ranch life isn't for everyone. It's hard and lonely, and you never know if this year is going to be the year that breaks you." Mason glanced at Elena. "What about you? What's your story?" Elena was quiet for so long that Mason thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "His name was David. I met him when I was 19, working at a diner in San Antonio. He was older, successful, charming. Made me feel like I was special, like I was worth something." Sophia stirred in her arms, and Elena's voice grew stronger as she looked down at her daughter. "For a while, it was everything I thought I wanted. Nice apartment, nice clothes, someone who seemed to love me. But then things started to change. Little things at first. He didn't like my friends, thought they were a bad influence. He didn't want me working, said he could take care of me. Before I knew it, I was completely dependent on him." Mason kept his expression carefully neutral, but his hands clenched into fists in his lap. "He never hit me," Elena continued, echoing words that Mason suspected she'd said to herself many times. "But he didn't have to. He had other ways of making sure I knew my place. The silent treatment when I displeased him. Controlling the money so I couldn't go anywhere. Making me feel like I was stupid, worthless, lucky that anyone would put up with me." "Elena," Mason started, but she held up a hand. "When I found out I was pregnant, I thought maybe things would get better, that having a baby would make him want to be the man I'd fallen in love with. Instead, it got worse. He was angry about the pregnancy, said it wasn't the right time, that I'd ruined everything. After Sophia was born, he barely looked at her. Said she cried too much, that she was going to ruin his career, his reputation." Elena's voice broke slightly, and Mason had to resist the urge to reach for her hand. "The night I left, he'd been drinking. Started saying things about Sophia, about how maybe we'd all be better off if she just disappeared. That's when I knew I had to go. I waited until he passed out, packed what I could carry, got the chickens, and started walking." Mason felt a rage building in his chest that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The idea of anyone threatening Elena was bad enough, but threatening a baby, his own child, was beyond comprehension. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice rough with suppressed anger. "Did I?" Elena asked, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I had no plan, no money, no idea where I was going. I could have gotten us both killed wandering around in the desert." "But you didn't," Mason said firmly. You trusted your instincts, you protected your daughter, and you kept going when most people would have given up. That takes more courage than most people have in their entire lives. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Some days I feel brave. Other days I feel like I'm just running scared. Maybe there's not much difference between the two, Mason suggested. Maybe being brave just means you keep running towards something better instead of staying in something bad. Elena looked at him with surprise, as if the thought had never occurred to her. I never thought of it that way. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. The chickens were making soft, contented noises from their new coop, and somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing peacefully. What happens if he comes looking for you? Mason asked quietly. Elena's body tensed, and Mason immediately regretted the question. But it had to be asked, had to be acknowledged. I don't know, Elena admitted. Part of me thinks he won't bother. He never really wanted Sophia, and I was more trouble than I was worth toward the end. But part of me thinks his pride won't let him just let us go. Mason leaned forward in his chair. If he shows up here, he'll have to go through me first. Elena turned to stare at him. Mason, you don't understand. David has money, connections. He could make things very difficult for you. Let him try, Mason said, his voice steady and sure. This is my land, my home, and you and Sophia are under my protection now. Elena felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight for too long. When was the last time someone had offered to protect her? When had anyone ever made her feel like she was worth defending? Why? She whispered. Why would you do that for us? Mason was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars. My grandmother used to say that everyone deserves a chance to start over, to become who they're meant to be instead of who someone else wants them to be. Maybe this is your chance. Elena felt tears spilling down her cheeks again, but these were different tears. Not tears of fear or exhaustion, but tears of something that felt dangerously close to hope. I don't know how to be anything other than afraid, she admitted. Then, we'll figure it out together, Mason said simply. The next few days fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural to Elena. She woke early, tended to Sophia, then joined Mason for breakfast before they began the day's work. There was always something that needed doing on a ranch, and Elena threw herself into the tasks with grateful energy. She learned to milk the 2 dairy cows that Mason kept, her city hands gradually developing the calluses and competence that came with real work. She helped repair fences, tend the vegetable garden, and even assisted with basic veterinary care when one of the cattle developed an infected cut. The chickens, meanwhile, had settled into their new home with obvious contentment. True to Elena's promise, they provided fresh eggs every morning, sometimes more than Mason and Elena could eat themselves. Esperanza had taken to following Elena around the yard like a feathered supervisor, offering commentary on every task. That bird thinks she's a dog, Mason observed one morning as Esperanza trotted along behind Elena, who was carrying a bucket of feed to the other animals. She's always been protective, Elena replied, pausing to scratch the hen's head. When Sophia was first born and I was too tired to get up at night, Esperanza would cluck whenever the baby cried, like she was trying to wake me up. Mason shook his head in amazement. I've never seen anything like it. Animals know things, Elena said seriously. They know when someone needs help, when someone needs protecting. Esperanza knew we were in trouble long before I was ready to admit it. As the days passed, Elena began to relax in ways she hadn't in years. Her shoulders lost their permanent tension, her smile came more easily, and her laughter became a regular sound around the ranch. Sophia seemed to sense her mother's growing peace, becoming more alert and playful, as the stress left Elena's system. Mason found himself looking forward to their morning conversations over coffee, to the sight of Elena bent over some project with focused concentration, to the way she hummed softly to Sophia while she worked. The ranch felt alive again in a way it hadn't since his grandmother's death. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Elena surprised him with a question. What do you dream about, Mason? He considered the question seriously. I used to dream about having a family here, kids running around the yard, a woman who loved this place as much as I do. After Sarah left, I guess I stopped dreaming about that. And now? Mason glanced at Elena, who was bouncing Sophia gently on her knee. The baby was gurgling happily, her tiny hands reaching for the colorful beads on Elena's borrowed necklace. Now I'm starting to remember what those dreams felt like, he said quietly. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. There was something in Mason's voice, in the way he was looking at her, that made her breath catch. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to belong here. Really belong, not just as someone trading eggs for shelter, but as someone who was home. Then reality crashed back in, and she looked away. I'm not ready for that, she said softly. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. Mason nodded, though she could see disappointment flicker across his features. I know, and that's okay. You don't owe me anything beyond what we agreed on. But even as he said it, both of them knew that what was growing between them had moved far beyond their original agreement. The daily eggs had become the least important part of their arrangement, overshadowed by something much more significant and much more fragile. That night, Elena lay awake listening to Sophia's peaceful breathing and thinking about dreams. For so long, her only dream had been escape, getting away from David and finding somewhere safe for Sophia. She hadn't dared to dream beyond that. Hadn't allowed herself to imagine what might come after safety. But now, lying in the comfortable bed in Mason's guest room, listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch at night, she found herself wondering what it would be like to stay. Not just until she figured out what came next, but really stay. To make this place home, to let Sophia grow up here, to let herself grow into the woman she might have been if fear hadn't shaped so many of her choices. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She'd learned not to trust good things, not to believe in happy endings. But Mason's quiet kindness, the peaceful rhythm of ranch life, the way Sophia seemed to thrive in the open air and sunshine, all of it was beginning to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a glimpse of what life could be. Outside her window, she could hear the soft sounds of the chickens settling in for the night. Tomorrow, Esperanza would lay another egg, and Elena would keep her part of the bargain. But somewhere deep in her heart, she was beginning to suspect that both she and Mason were hoping for something that went far beyond their simple trade. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Elena's last thought was of Mason's words about dreams. Maybe it was time to start dreaming again. Maybe it was time to believe that someone like her could have something beautiful and lasting. Maybe it was time to trust that she deserved more than just survival. In the morning, there would be work to do, eggs to collect, and another day of the careful dance they'd been doing around their growing feelings. But tonight, for the first time in years, Elena Morales fell asleep with hope in her heart and dreams of a future that looked suspiciously like home. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Elena noticed Esperanza acting strangely. The usually confident hen was pacing nervously around the coop, her head cocked as if listening for something only she could hear. Elena had learned to trust her bird's instincts over the weeks they'd been at the ranch, and Esperanza's agitation made her own pulse quicken. "What is it, girl?" Elena murmured, crouching beside the coop. Faye and Caridad seemed calm enough, pecking at their morning feed without concern, but Esperanza continued her restless patrol. Mason emerged from the barn, leading his horse Thunder toward the pasture. He noticed Elena's troubled expression and changed direction, approaching the chicken coop with measured steps. "Something wrong with the girls?" "Esperanza spooked about something," Elena replied, her voice tight with worry. "She gets like this when danger's coming." Mason's expression grew serious. In the month Elena had been at the ranch, he'd learned to respect her understanding of her chickens. They seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, and their warnings had proven accurate more than once. "What kind of danger?" Mason asked, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Elena's shoulder. Before she could answer, the sound of a car engine reached them from the direction of the main road. It was still distant but growing closer, and Elena's entire body went rigid at the sound. "Nobody comes down this road," Mason said quietly. "Not unless they're looking for something specific." Elena's face had gone pale, and Sophia, sensing her mother's distress, began to fuss in her arms. "It could be anyone," Elena whispered, but her voice held no conviction. The engine sound grew louder, and soon a black sedan appeared through the dust, moving too fast for the rough ranch road. Elena took several steps backward, her arms tightening protectively around Sophia. "Get in the house," Mason said, his voice calm but commanding. "Take Sophia and go to the back bedroom. Lock the door." "Mason, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Mason interrupted firmly. "You're letting me protect what's mine." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither had spoken aloud before. Elena met his eyes and saw something there that made her chest tight with emotion and terror in equal measure. "Be careful," she whispered, then hurried toward the house with Sophia clutched against her chest. The sedan pulled up in front of the ranch house, sending up a cloud of dust that made the chickens scatter toward their coop. Mason positioned himself between the car and the house, his stance relaxed, but ready. He dealt with his share of unwelcome visitors over the years, but something about this felt different, more dangerous. The car door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and well-dressed, wearing an expensive suit that looked completely out of place on a working ranch. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his shoes were the kind that had never touched dirt before today. Everything about him screamed money and control, and Mason felt his jaw clench as he took in the man's predatory smile. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I'm looking for someone, a woman with a baby. I believe they might have wandered onto your property." Mason kept his expression neutral. "Don't know anything about that. This is private property, though. You're trespassing." The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "David Restrepo," he said, extending a manicured hand that Mason pointedly ignored. "I'm sure we can work something out. The woman I'm looking for, she's not well. Postpartum depression, you understand. She took my daughter without permission. Like I said, haven't seen anyone matching that description." David's facade began to crack slightly. "Look, Cowboy, I know she's here. Her ridiculous chickens were spotted by someone in town. All I want is my daughter back. Elena can do whatever she wants, but Sophia belongs with her father." Mason's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Funny thing about that, most fathers don't need to hire private investigators to track down their own children. David's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't know what you're dealing with here. Elena is unstable, delusional. She's filled your head with lies about me." "The only thing Elena's filled my head with is respect," Mason replied evenly. "For her courage, her strength, and her love for that little girl." "That little girl is my daughter," David snarled, his polished mask finally slipping completely. "And I will not be kept from her by some dirt-poor rancher who doesn't know his place." Mason took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My place is between you and them. And that's exactly where I intend to stay." David reached into his jacket, and Mason tensed, but the man only pulled out a thick envelope. "There's $10,000 in here, cash. Take it. Forget you ever saw them, and everyone walks away happy." Mason looked at the envelope with disgust. "Keep your money. You're not welcome here." "20,000, David said quickly. "I know this place is struggling. I did my research. That's enough to pay off your debts and then some." The fact that David had investigated his finances made Mason's blood boil. But he kept his voice level. "There's not enough money in the world to make me sell out a woman and child to someone like you." David's face twisted with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have lawyers, connections, resources you can't even imagine. I will destroy you and this pathetic little ranch." "You're welcome to try," Mason replied calmly. "But right now, you need to get off my land." David stared at him for a long moment, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he smiled again, but this time the expression was purely venomous. "This isn't over," he said, climbing back into his car. "Elena belongs to me, and so does my daughter. I always get what's mine." Mason watched the sedan disappear back down the road, but he didn't relax until the engine sound had faded completely. Only then did he turn and walk quickly toward the house, his heart pounding with adrenaline and concern for Elena. He found her in the back bedroom, sitting on the floor with her back against the door, and Sophia clutched in her arms. Her face was streaked with tears, and her entire body was shaking. "He's gone," Mason said softly, kneeling beside her. "He's gone, Elena." Elena looked up at him with eyes that held a pain so deep it made Mason's chest ache. "You heard him, didn't you? You heard what he said about me." "I heard a desperate man trying to manipulate the situation," Mason replied, gently touching her cheek. I heard someone who's lost control trying to get it back. He said I was unstable, delusional. He lied. Mason interrupted firmly. Elena, look at me. He lied. You are the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever known. What you did, leaving him to protect Sophia, that wasn't the action of someone unstable. That was the action of a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her child. Elena buried her face in Sophia's hair, her shoulders shaking with sobs. He'll be back. He won't give up. He never gives up. Mason pulled her gently into his arms, careful not to disturb Sophia. Then we'll be ready for him. But Elena, you need to know something. You don't have to face this alone anymore. Elena pulled back to look at him, tears still streaming down her face. Mason, I can't ask you to fight my battles. This isn't your problem. It became my problem the moment I cared about you, Mason said quietly. The moment I fell in love with you. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Neither of them had spoken the word love before, though it had been hanging between them for weeks, like morning mist, waiting for the sun to burn it away. You can't love me, Elena whispered. I'm broken, damaged. I come with too much baggage, too many problems. Mason cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. You're not broken, Elena. You're healing. And healing takes time, takes patience. I've got plenty of both. What if he comes back with lawyers? What if he tries to take Sophia? Then we'll fight him, Mason said simply. Together. But Elena, you need to understand something. This is your choice to make. If you want to keep running, I'll help you. I'll give you money, a truck, whatever you need, to start somewhere new. But if you want to stay and fight, if you want to make this place your home, then I'm with you all the way. Elena stared at him through her tears, seeing something in his eyes that she'd never seen in David's. Where David's love had been possessive and controlling, Mason's was generous and freeing. He was offering her a choice, real choice, maybe for the first time in her adult life. I'm scared, she admitted. I know. But being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. Elena looked down at Sophia, who had fallen asleep in her arms despite the tension surrounding them. Her daughter's face was peaceful, trusting, completely secure in her mother's embrace. What kind of life did she want for Sophia? What kind of woman did she want to be for her daughter? I'm tired of running, Elena said quietly. I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of letting him control my life even when he's not around. Mason felt hope bloom in his chest, but he kept his voice careful and steady. What does that mean? Elena met his eyes, and Mason saw something new there, something that looked like determination. It means I want to stay. It means I want to fight. But Mason, I need you to understand what you're signing up for. David meant what he said about having resources, connections. He could make things very difficult for you. Let him try, Mason replied. I've been fighting for this ranch my whole life. Fighting for you and Sophia just gives me something better to fight for. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been locked tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. It was hope, real hope, the kind that dared to believe in happy endings. I love you too, she whispered, and watched Mason's face transform with joy. He kissed her then, gently, carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. When they pulled apart, Elena rested her forehead against his. What happens now? She asked. Now we make this official, Mason replied. We get you a lawyer, document everything David's done, file for full custody of Sophia. We make it legal and airtight so he can never threaten you again. Elena nodded, feeling a strength she hadn't known she possessed. And the eggs? Mason laughed, the sound warm and full of love. The eggs were never really the point, were they? No, Elena agreed, smiling through her tears. They weren't. Over the next few weeks, Mason proved as good as his word. He helped Elena find a lawyer who specialized in domestic abuse cases, a fierce woman named Patricia Santos, who took one look at Elena's story and agreed to take the case pro bono. They documented everything: David's harassment, his threats, his attempt to bribe Mason, building a case that would protect Elena and Sophia permanently. David tried several more approaches. He sent lawyers with threatening letters, hired a private investigator to watch the ranch, even attempted to have Elena declared an unfit mother through social services. But each attack was met with legal countermeasures, and Mason's steady presence gave Elena the strength to fight back instead of running. The chickens, meanwhile, continued to provide their daily eggs, but they'd become so much more than that. They were a symbol of Elena's determination to build something lasting, something that couldn't be taken away by threats or manipulation. Esperanza had appointed herself Sophia's protector, often sleeping near the baby's window and raising an alarm whenever strangers approached. On a warm evening in late spring, Elena sat on the porch swing with Sophia in her lap, watching Mason repair a section of fence. The baby was 6 months old now, bright and alert and clearly thriving in the ranch environment. She babbled happily at the chickens, who had learned to stay just out of reach of her grasping hands. Mason looked up from his work and caught Elena watching him. The smile that passed between them was full of shared understanding, of battles fought and won, of a future that stretched out before them like an open road. "Patricia called today," Elena said as Mason joined them on the porch. "The custody hearing is set for next month." Mason nodded, settling beside her on the swing. "How do you feel about it?" Elena considered the question. 6 months ago, the thought of facing David in court would have terrified her. Now, while she was still nervous, she felt something else too. Confidence. Determination. The knowledge that she was fighting not just for herself but for Sophia's future. "Ready," she said simply. Mason took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." "Together," Elena agreed, the word feeling like a promise. That night, after Sophia was asleep and the ranch had settled into peaceful quiet, Elena found herself walking out to the chicken coop. The 3 hens were roosting contentedly, their soft clucking a familiar lullaby that had become the soundtrack of her new life. Esperanza opened one eye as Elena approached, but didn't seem alarmed. The hen had long since accepted that Elena's late-night visits were just part of their routine. "Thank you," Elena whispered to her feathered friend, "for watching over us, for warning us when danger was coming, for helping me find my way here." Esperanza ruffled her feathers and made a soft sound that Elena chose to interpret as, "You're welcome." Elena looked out over the ranch, taking in the moonlit landscape that had become home. The guest room had been officially transformed into Sophia's nursery, complete with a crib Mason had built with his own hands. Elena's few possessions had found their way into Mason's room, a gradual migration that neither of them had formally discussed but both had welcomed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight and obstacles to overcome. David hadn't given up his legal maneuvering, and the custody hearing loomed large in Elena's mind. But tonight, standing in the moonlight with her chickens roosting peacefully nearby and the man she loved sleeping in the house behind her, Elena Morales felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The wind picked up across the Texas plains, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Elena lifted her face to the breeze and smiled. She'd learned to read the signs now, to understand what the land was telling her. This wind didn't bring danger or uncertainty. It brought renewal, the promise of growth and new beginnings. Inside the house, Sophia stirred in her crib, and Elena hurried back to check on her daughter. The baby was still sleeping, but she'd kicked off her blanket in the warm night. Elena gently covered her again, marveling as she always did at the perfect curve of Sophia's cheek, the impossibly tiny fingers that held so much of Elena's heart. "You're going to grow up here," Elena whispered to her sleeping daughter. "You're going to know what it feels like to be safe, to be wanted, to be free, and you're going to know that your mama fought for that freedom." As if hearing her mother's promise, Sophia smiled in her sleep, the kind of innocent, peaceful expression that made all the struggles worthwhile. Elena made her way to the bedroom she now shared with Mason, where she found him awake and waiting for her. "Everything okay?" he asked softly, making room for her beside him. "Everything's perfect," Elena replied, settling into his arms, and for the first time in her life she truly meant it. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight, Elena was home. She'd arrived barefoot with a baby and 3 chickens, and she'd found something she'd never dared to dream of: love, safety, and the chance to build a life worth living. The eggs had been just the beginning. 6 months later, Elena stood in the courthouse wearing a simple blue dress that Mason's grandmother would have loved. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands were steady as she held the legal documents that would change everything. Patricia Santos had prepared her well for this moment, but Elena's confidence came from something deeper than legal strategy. It came from knowing she was fighting for the right reasons. David sat across the courtroom with his expensive lawyers, his face a mask of cold fury. He'd tried everything in his arsenal over the past months, from bribery to intimidation to character assassination, but Elena had weathered each attack with Mason's unwavering support and her own growing strength. Judge Margaret Shin called the court to order, her gray eyes sharp and intelligent as she surveyed the packed courtroom. Elena felt Mason's presence in the gallery behind her, a steady anchor in the storm of legal proceedings. This court will now hear arguments in the matter of Morales versus Restrepo regarding custody of the minor child Sofia Morales, Judge Chen announced. Elena's lawyer rose first, her voice clear and confident as she outlined the case. The evidence was overwhelming. David's history of emotional abuse, his threats against both Elena and Sofia, his complete absence from his daughter's life, until he decided he wanted to control the situation again. When David's lead attorney stood to present his case, Elena felt her old fears trying to resurface. The man was smooth and persuasive, painting Elena as an unstable woman who'd kidnapped an innocent man's child. But Elena had learned something important over the past months. The truth had its own power, and she no longer feared it. "Your Honor," David's lawyer concluded, "my client simply wants to be reunited with his daughter. Ms. Morales has denied him that fundamental right." Judge Chen looked directly at Elena. "Ms. Morales, I'd like to hear from you directly. Why should this court grant you sole custody of your daughter?" Elena stood slowly, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for custody to punish David or to keep him from Sofia out of spite. I'm asking for it because my daughter deserves to grow up in a home where she's wanted, where she's safe, where love isn't used as a weapon." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "When I left David, I had nothing but the clothes on my back and 3 chickens that had been my grandmother's. I walked for days with Sofia in my arms because I knew that staying meant watching my daughter grow up, thinking that fear was normal, that love was supposed to hurt." Elena's voice grew stronger. "I found sanctuary at Mason Rodriguez's ranch, where I learned what real love looks like. It's patient and kind and generous. It doesn't demand or control or threaten. It simply offers itself freely and trusts the other person to choose." She turned slightly toward David. "For months, David has tried to force me to return through lawyers and private investigators and threats. That's not love, Your Honor. That's possession. And my daughter is not property to be owned." Judge Chen listened intently, occasionally making notes. When Elena finished speaking, the courtroom was silent except for the soft whisper of the air conditioning. "Mr. Restrepo," Judge Chen said, "do you have anything to add?" David rose, his face a careful mask of wounded innocence. "Your Honor, I made mistakes, I admit that. But I'm Sofia's father, and I've changed. I want the chance to be the man my daughter deserves." "And yet," Judge Chen observed, consulting her notes, "you've made no attempt to see your daughter in the past 8 months, except through legal channels. You've offered bribes to Mr. Rodriguez and made threats against Ms. Morales. These don't seem like the actions of a reformed man seeking genuine reconciliation." David's composure cracked slightly. "I was desperate to see my child." "You were desperate to maintain control," Judge Chen interrupted firmly. "The evidence before this court paints a clear picture of a pattern of emotional abuse and manipulation that continued even after Ms. Morales left your home." Elena felt tears of relief beginning to form as she sensed the judge's decision. "Therefore," Judge Chen continued, "this court grants sole legal and physical custody of Sofia Morales to her mother, Elena Morales. Mr. Restrepo's parental rights are hereby terminated due to his history of abuse and his demonstrated unwillingness to prioritize his child's well-being over his own need for control." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Elena's entire body. She was free. Sofia was safe. David could never threaten them again. As they left the courthouse, Elena found herself surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family. Mason wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off her feet in a jubilant hug that made Sophia giggle with delight. Patricia Santos smiled with professional satisfaction, while Mason's neighbor Maria, who had testified about Elena's transformation over the past months, wiped away happy tears. "It's over," Elena whispered against Mason's neck. "It's really over." "No," Mason said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "It's just beginning." 3 weeks later, Elena stood in the same blue dress, in a very different setting. The ranch's back pasture had been transformed into a wedding venue, with simple wooden chairs arranged in rows and wildflowers scattered everywhere. The chickens roamed freely among the guests, with Esperanza wearing a tiny crown of daisies that Sophia had insisted upon. Elena's hands shook slightly as she adjusted her grandmother's pearl necklace, the only piece of jewelry she'd managed to save from her old life. Maria bustled around her, fussing with her hair and muttering in rapid Spanish about how beautiful she looked. "Ready, Mija?" Patricia asked, appearing in the doorway of the house. She'd agreed to walk Elena down the aisle, having become something of a surrogate mother over the months of legal battles. Elena took a deep breath, looking out at the assembled guests. Mason's friends and neighbors had embraced her completely, treating her not as an outsider but as someone who belonged. Several of the women had brought dishes for the reception, turning the celebration into a true community gathering. "I'm ready," Elena said, and meant it completely. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, officiated by the local pastor who had married Mason's grandparents 50 years earlier. Mason looked impossibly handsome in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Elena's face as she walked toward him across the grass. Sophia, now almost a year old and taking her first tentative steps, served as the world's most adorable ring-bearer, toddling between her parents with the rings tied to her wrist with ribbon. When she reached Mason, she held up her arms to be picked up, making the entire congregation laugh with delight. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying across the pasture, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Mason Rodriguez and Elena Morales in holy matrimony." Elena barely heard the traditional words, focused instead on Mason's face and the promise she saw there. When it came time for vows, they decided to speak from their hearts rather than recite standard words. Mason went first, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Elena, you arrived at my ranch with nothing but your courage and your love for Sophia. You brought light back into a house that had been dark for too long. You taught me that love isn't about possession or control, but about creating space for someone else to flourish. I promise to be your partner, your protector, and your biggest supporter for all the days of my life." Elena's voice was strong as she replied, "Mason, you gave me something I'd never had before. The freedom to choose love instead of fear. You showed me that home isn't a place, it's the feeling of being completely accepted for who you are. I promise to build this life with you, to face whatever comes with courage, and to love you with the same generosity you've shown me." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Mason's kiss was gentle and full of promise. Sophia clapped her hands from her position in Patricia's arms, and Esperanza let out a triumphant cluck that seemed to express everyone's joy. The reception lasted well into the evening, with neighbors sharing stories and laughter under the Texas stars. Elena found herself dancing with Sophia in her arms while Mason played guitar, the baby squealing with delight at the music and movement. Later, as the last guests were saying their goodbyes, Elena slipped away to check on the chickens. She found them roosting peacefully in their coop, content and secure in their home. "Thank you," she whispered to Esperanza, who opened one sleepy eye to acknowledge her. "For bringing us here, for keeping us safe, for being part of our family." Mason found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" Elena leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the security of being truly loved. "I was thinking about the morning I walked up to your gate. I was so scared, so desperate. I thought I was just looking for water and shelter. And instead you found home," Mason finished softly. "Instead I found everything," Elena corrected. "Love, safety, purpose, family. I found myself." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch at night. Sophia was sleeping peacefully in the house, and their future stretched out before them like an open road full of possibilities. "What do you think she'll remember about all this?" Lena asked, thinking of her daughter. "I think she'll remember being loved," Mason replied. "She'll remember that her mama was brave enough to fight for a better life, and that love won in the end." Elena turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had become her anchor, her partner, her heart. "Do you think we'll always be this happy?" Mason smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think we'll have challenges, disagreements, hard times like everyone else. But I also think we'll face them together, and that makes all the difference." Elena stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, tasting promise and hope and the sweet certainty of being exactly where she belonged. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you, husband," she whispered, the words still new and wonderful on her tongue. "I love you too, wife," Mason replied, his voice full of wonder at the miracle of it all. As they walked back toward the house, hand in hand, Elena caught sight of the chicken coop one more time. Tomorrow morning, Esperanza would lay another egg, just as she had every day since arriving at the ranch. But the eggs had never really been about the eggs at all. They'd been about hope, about second chances, about the faith that good things could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. Elena Morales had arrived barefoot with a baby in a chicken coop, running from a life that had tried to break her spirit. She'd found a cowboy who offered her shelter in exchange for daily eggs. But what she'd really found was the courage to believe in love again. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simplest offers. Stay if you're too tired to run. Sometimes healing comes not through grand gestures, but through daily kindness, shared work, and the patient tending of small, precious things. Elena's story was proof that it's never too late to choose hope over fear, that courage can grow from the smallest seeds, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is trust your feet to carry you toward the love that's waiting just around the bend. As Mason had once told her, maybe being brave just meant running toward something better instead of staying in something that hurt. Elena had run toward better, and better had been waiting for her all along, wearing cowboy boots and offering her the world in exchange for something as simple as fresh eggs every morning. The ranch settled into peaceful silence around them, and Elena knew that tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new joys. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged. Home, safe, and surrounded by the love she'd fought so hard to find. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.